It's wonderful to welcome John Womack Jr. to this podcast. He is the professor of Latin American history and economics emeritus at Harvard University. And today we're discussing the great Mexican revolutionary Emiliano Zapata. You wrote a book about it titled Zapata and the Mexican Revolution some years ago. So, John, welcome to the show. How are you?
Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you very much. What can I tell you uh, about the book or Zapata?
Both, of course. But I'd like to begin by stating, well, first how I know you, because you know one of my favorite filmmakers and what I think to be the greatest American filmmaker of all time, Terrence Malick. And you appeared in his debut feature, Badlands, as a small role. That movie
Yeah.
has Martin Sheen and Sissy Spacek in it. So yeah, tell me about your friendship with him.
I met Terry in, I think, 1966 at Harvard in a student dining hall. He was a senior, and I was a very junior teacher. And we had mutual friends, and Terry had a scholarship to go to Oxford University, and I had the same scholarship some years before, and I didn't. For one reason or another, I didn't much like being in Oxford. I had a few good, very good, wonderful teachers there, but on the whole, the experience was pretty well, particularly in the college where we lived for a year. But in general, I was glad to be back to the United States. And so our mutual friend thought that I ought to tell Terry about my experience, and I did. And so we became, so anyway, he then went to Oxford, and I think spent less time there than I had. And then later, we he came back, I think, to Cambridge for a while and was teaching along with our mutual friend and some other friends at MIT philosophy they were teaching. And so I got to know him again there in Cambridge. And then by the time he soon got a grant, a fellowship to go to the American Film Institute, and so he went there and started making various kinds of movies, films, and then set about making the movie which became Badlands, and he asked me if I would like to be a state trooper, and I said sure. And so my then wife and I actually we flew, I think, originally to Tucson and then drove along the way to Colorado to the Colorado Springs, where they were based while they made the movie. Colorado Springs. It was great to see Terry, and I met the various people, Martin Sheen and Sissy Spacek. They weren't famous then, as they later became, but so it was a good time.
Mhm. That's wonderful. And are you still keeping in contact?
Yeah, yeah, we talk often.
Mhm.
He's in Austin, making another movie.
Yes, I hope to see Terrence Malick's new film. I really enjoyed his last one, A Hidden Life, which is a very powerful story.
It's a wonderful. He makes wonderful movies. They're about the only movies I see these days. I mean, when they come out, I see very few movies. I used to go to movies a lot, but I basically only see his movies now when they come.
Okay, so oh, Emiliano Zapata. Tell me, how would you make a case for a deeper understanding amongst American for the history of Mexico?
Well, for one thing, it sits on the border, and for another thing, a lot of Mexicans uh, have moved to the United States. And so the United States, though it doesn't pay normally doesn't pay much attention to Mexico, is somehow inextricably connected with it. And so the more, I should say, also more Americans are moving to Mexico now, not only because of politics, but because their retirement goes further in Mexico than it does here, and so it's good for them to learn something about where they're going to move. Uh, but also, I would say that for Americans of a mind that likes very complicated questions and is fascinated with complexity. Mexico is a good place to get into, is a good history to get into. It's extraordinarily complicated, much more so than U.S. history, which is complicated enough. But Mexican history is thousands of years old, and and its relations with the United States over the last 200 and odd years since it became independent were and I should say also that before Mexico became independent, Spain's part of North America and the Spanish influence on that part is something that Americans might very well pay attention to, since that still matters. Uh, but then the Mexican Revolution which is what I wrote about, was at that time it just astounded Americans because they hadn't expected anything like that. Mexico had a very stable regime running the country for 30 years. There was a lot of American investment in Mexico then, and as there still is, but then there was new American investment, and there were great rivalries over investments between the Americans, the British, and Germans and French. And so when this blew up in 1910, 1911, nobody anywhere expected it, neither in Mexico nor in the United States. And then it got more explosive and more disorder and violence. And then World War I started in 1914, and there was nothing that the United States really could do, nothing much the United States could do about Mexico, because it had all of its armed forces, or most of its, well, it had all of them after 1917 in Europe, and was afraid to send them to Mexico before that because they anticipated they might be needed in Europe. And so uh, some very interesting to me anyway, and I think to a number. Well, I should say that that book in 2019 had been in print for 50 years. So it's interested some people along over the last 50 years in order to stay in print. And so the part that I wrote about was not where most of the violent action took place, which was in the north of the country. But I wrote about a particular rebellion of sharecroppers in the south of Mexico City anyway, not terribly far south, but still in the southern part of the country. And why they rebelled, how they expanded from their initial base, and what part they had in the greater violence going on in the country, and and how they influenced it, and finally how they got beat and really got incorporated then into the new regime that appeared after the violence died down. Along the way, the particular guy that I had concentrated on, who led this rebellion, Zapata, the other one band of the other revolutionaries had him killed, and so it was a particularly complicated and in some ways sad history to study and to try to write about.
Okay. So before we get into Emiliano Zapata, I have two questions. I'm glad you mentioned the First World War because the casus belli for the United States to enter into the war was a telegram, the Zimmerman telegram that was intercepted by British intelligence that proposed an alliance between Germany and Mexico. So from the side of the Mexicans, did the new revolutionary regime ever considered, taking up that offer from the German Empire?
I don't think that they may have considered it, but they didn't take it seriously, I think. Because all the revolutionaries, like all the Mexican politicians before them, knew that the United States was a great power then, and that it was but they also knew that there were other great powers, and so they were continually trying to jockey back and forth between them and to scare one power with the prospect of an alliance with another power in order to get the first power to relent in some way and give it some benefit. They were all doing that. And when the Zimmerman telegram, the British found it and gave it to the Americans. And when that happened, the British, in part, did it because they thought, well, we can get the United States now to join us against Germany. But basically the Mexicans didn't make much of it, and it sort of was it was a great issue at the moment, but it didn't last for very long.
Okay. Now, one more thing I should mention is that so we're recording on the 25th of November, so a few days before Thanksgiving. So I would like to wish you a happy Thanksgiving beforehand.
Sorry, what was the question?
And all right, secondly, I'd like to mention that the 23rd of November is the anniversary of the death of Blessed Miguel Pro, the Jesuit priest
Right.
who was killed by the post-revolutionary regime. And I think most Americans these days would think of Mexico as a Catholic country, but there was a time after the revolution that the church was heavily persecuted. So I'd like to ask for the context of that.
Um, Beginning in, I think it was 19, well, there'd been uh, simmering hostilities at a popular level among sort of ordinary people uh, against the government, Catholics, as most ordinary people were in Mexico, against the government because the government was officially, well, agnostic. It was officially not religious. It was officially not Catholic. And there was a lot among people associated with the government, a lot of hostility to the church in newspapers and public discourse and so on. The church had, but it had some defenders in the sort of Mexican establishment before the revolution. But during the revolution, all, I would say the revolutionaries in the South were sort of friendlier to Catholicism. Zapata's forces occupied Mexico City at one point, and they entered through a bunch of villages south of Mexico City, where there had been a very active priest, and they entered the city bearing big banners, which had displayed the Virgin of Guadalupe, who was a sort of a patron saint for Catholics of Mexico. And but after, say, the violence died down, and you had a more or less stable government in Mexico in 1920, that the church had and the government were both different. The church had a very strong, by then, a new strong social mission, and both the Jesuits and the ordinary priests and ordinary Catholics were had a very they had picked up on Pope Leo's doctrines of social cause, and they were pressing it. And the government, after 1920, became increasingly, particularly after 1924, when a new president came in, Plutarco Elias Calles. He was from an anti-clerical background, and a lot of people then, in order to get on his good side, began to, I would say, persecute the church. And the church then, the bishops, Catholic bishops, closed all the churches in Mexico as a sort of strike against this new anti-clerical policies. And they and so there was a lot of ordinary Catholics couldn't go to church, couldn't go to communion, couldn't get married, couldn't get baptized, and so on, because all that had to take place in church, and the churches were closed. And in 1926, then some Catholics in the western part of Mexico, in the state of Michoacan and the state of Jalisco, and north of there, revolted, that is, with arms against the government, and under the banner of sort of Christ the King, Cristo Rey. And so they got called Cristeros, and their movement was called the Cristiada. And So that lasted. The bishops tried in some way to sort of, I wouldn't say pacify it, but somehow get some kind of agreement with the government so that this rebellion wouldn't continue. But the rebellion did continue for 3 years, and finally in 1929, under a new president, they made some sort of peace. And since then, there hadn't been that kind of, well, I should say it erupted again briefly, and in fewer places in the 1930s and 1940s, off and on, but not anything like it had been before. But it was in that earlier period that Father Miguel Pro was arrested and accused of all of leading violence and so on, and executed.
I believe he was falsely implicated in a conspiracy to assassinate one of the general, right? Obregon, I believe that's his name.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
19, or 20, I think it was 28. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I believe the year is 1927, and yeah, Obregon was a general. He survived the assassination attempt, I believe.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's get to Zapata. I understand that Americans may be more familiar with the name of another Mexican revolutionary, Pancho Villa. Are Zapata and Pancho Villa associated with each other in some way?
Well, yeah, I don't think they'd met before 1914. But in 1914, they had both occupied Mexico City. And So their armies were, or at least large parts of their armies, were in Mexico City, and there were serious movements by their advisors to try to get an agreement between the two of them, so that they could unite their armed forces against a third revolutionary force led by a civilian, but by then called a general, Venustiano Carranza, and who was from the northeast of Mexico, but he had some strong forces behind him from northwestern Mexico. And Villa's forces came mostly from Chihuahua in the direct north part of the country and further south. And Zapata's were from basically from central and south Mexico. And so there were serious efforts for them to ally. And there was a kind of a provisional government created that they called the Convention, the convention, which met at first in Mexico City, and then in a state north of there in Aguascalientes. And for some months, we had discussions and the debates and so on. There were representatives of many parts of Mexico in the convention, and they tried to. They made up various a program of reforms that the country would supposedly, if they ran it, would supposedly adopt. But eventually the Carranza's forces were able to divide Villa and Zapata. Villa and Zapata never were hostile to each other, but to separate them, I guess would be better to say, and beat Villa in the north and central parts of the country in some big battles. Villa he was able to keep some remnants of his forces going in the north, and but eventually they made some kind of peace for a few years until the government assassinated him in 1923. Zapata was left alone in the south part of the country, and the same revolutionaries really besieged him and sort of burned villages. And it's like what happens in a lot of places, what's happening in Dow and Gaza. And so Zapata's forces were much diminished, and finally, then one of those revolutionaries was able to assassinate him in 1919. And so by the mid 1920s, the two most what should I say, literally revolutionary leaders had been killed, and the officially revolutionary leaders were running the country in a new kind of regime.
Now, how is Zapata remembered both in Mexico and amongst Mexican Americans today?
Um, I well, he's remembered at two levels. I would say most people remember him from what they were taught in school, which was that he was a great hero of the revolution. But that eliminates the fact that the revolution had him killed. And but still, he's I would say he's venerable among the most Mexicans. That people name their children Emiliano. They still celebrate different dates associated with his life, and uh, they but then there are others, particularly from the north, who and I think basically a racist way think of him as an Indian, and don't take him seriously, think that he was a bandit and a terrorist and so on. But they don't get much of a platform nationally. If Americans know anything about him, it's I think basically from that movie of Marlon Brando's, where he's again a sort of a sympathetic character, and Brando made him very sympathetic, and so that's what happens in the U.S. Um, and some people have read my book, I know, otherwise it wouldn't still be in print. And they may have a somewhat different impression. One thing I should say, in 2000 and I think it was 2017, I published. The book was translated and published in Mexico, I think in 1971. I'm not sure. But 1917, there was a second edition, and I wrote a new sort of prologue for it, and which I put the question of what explains the fact that the sharecroppers revolt, which began in a particular village, and how it expanded to include many other parts of Mexico, some of them in the north. Um, and I argued that this was because of something that's ordinarily not given any attention in Mexico, but that it had to do with the the slave history of people in the South. In parts of the South, in particular in the South, in the state of Morelos and the state of Guerrero and the state of Puebla, there's a lot of sugar there. And so sugar had been an important crop there for hundreds of years, ever since the Spanish sort of brought it. And for those hundreds of years, the workers on those plantations had been African slaves, as a percentage of the population as a whole. It was small, but in that part of the country, it was very large. And it was still a minority, but it was a large minority. And the thing about slaves, and I learned this because of teaching a course on Cuba, where there were also a lot of slaves, is that they were really unlike villages in Mexico, which were not part of a labor market. If you were in a village in Mexico, you really were just part of that local community, and you wouldn't leave. And anybody from the outside didn't belong there. And so they were very tightly closed communities. But if you were a slave on a plantation next door, you were in a labor market because people could buy and sell you, and Mexicans did buy and sell them. And so they got used to a very different kind of life, which was much more open to the outside world, and anything could be new the next day. You could be sold and sent somewhere you'd never been. And so Zapata himself was, I think, a grandson of a slave who had still been a slave after Mexican independence. There was still slavery in Mexico until, I think, 1829. And his grandfather had been a worker on the neighboring plantation, and almost certainly a slave, who, after he was free, left that plantation and came to the village where Zapata's mother was. She wasn't yet, didn't have him yet, but they got married, and so his father never really fit in that community, though he was a part of it, but he didn't really belong the way that other people did. And Zapata himself, I think, he had a farm there, or he was a sharecropper, and but he was also a horse trainer. And so he would continually move all around in the horse markets in that part of Mexico and in Mexico City too. And so he was very used to sort of dealing with people on the outside, new people, new places, and so on. And so that, I argued, was part of why the movement was able to grow from a village to really expand remarkably through the country. And I don't know whether Mexicans have adopted that or not, but anyway, I argued that.
Yeah, before we continue, I'd like to mention that the movie that you mentioned is Viva Zapata, obviously starring Marlon Brando, but directed by Elia Kazan. And I think it's today is kind of largely forgotten compared to their other collaborations, Streetcar and On the Waterfront. And
Yeah.
so tell me about the old regime, so to speak, the pre-revolutionary regime of Mexico, and what were the discontents that led to the revolution happening?
Well, Mexican land before the revolution was a very contentious object. There was nothing like in the United States, there was nothing like a general land office which had surveyed the land, so that you could have you knew what land belonged to whom, whether it belonged to the federal government or some individual proprietor. But much of the land in Mexico had for centuries belonged to communities, and they weren't collective farms, but the community owned the land, and that members of the community who were lifelong members inherited rights from their fathers and mothers would inherit a plot of land, and their children would inherit the same plot. And those communities were um, uh, they were progressively, after Mexican independence, progressively disorganized and dismantled. Um, some still existed. I don't want to minimize, or I don't think anybody should minimize the numbers of communities that still existed in 1910 when everything blew up. But lots of communities had disappeared, and people had lost their land, and it went to big landowners. They could go to court and say this community doesn't have titles to its land, and that would be true because there weren't titles. Um, and the landowner could say, well, and so this I'll buy it. And since nobody owns it, they would buy it from the government, and or claim that he'd always owned it. And since those people dominated the courts, they could accumulate very large properties. And that was the case maybe in its strongest form in Morelos, where there had been lots of communities before and fewer in 1910, and there were very large. Morelos was the biggest sugar producer in Mexico in 1910, because of these big sugar plantations. And Zapata was from one of those communities, and but there were maybe 100 of them in a small state, but they were all under heavy pressure from the surrounding sugar plantations, and in that sense, they all had similar problems. But they were also it was hard for them to because they were so enclosed in themselves. It was hard for them to sort of make alliances with each other, and so they would sometimes make. They would all go to the same lawyer, who would go to a court in Mexico City to try to resolve their disputes with the plantations. But what Zapata did was really something new, and it brought together a lot of villages in the beginning, and then increasingly as the violence wore on, more and more of them, and then expanded. I think because of this factor that I tried to argue before about the kind of different outlook that that descendants of slaves had. That really that attitude was very prominent for instance, appeals in as far away as states bordering the north, and made what had started as a regional, as a local, and then became regional, became a national movement before it was crushed.
Mhm. Now, to what extent was the rule or the dictatorship of General Porfirio Diaz a factor? Uh,
Uh, um, that's a very is still. I think that's a very interesting question, and is much more complicated than you usually read. I mean, what you usually read is that Diaz became a dictator in 1876. He revolted, got the government, and held on to it and commanded everything for what, 35 years and 34, 35. And I think it's more complicated than that. For one thing, he wasn't in office for all that time. He was out of office between 1880 and 84, but he was steadily in office from 84 to 1910, 1911. And I think he, it was a complicated regime. He had enemies high up in different positions of power in the country. There were people in his cabinet who wanted to succeed him, and then I should say also that there were, despite that his continuous reign, there were elections every 4 years. And so there was always the threat that somebody in one of the people in his cabinet would run against him and make alliances with some of his enemies. And then there were governors who were powerful in their regions. And there was always the threat that some of them would make alliances. And so as much as it was him commanding people to do stuff, it was more often that he was making coalitions of different coalitions at different times to keep enemies against at hostile to enemies. And so, if you're an enemy of my enemy, you're on my side. And so there was a lot of that over all these 25 years, uh, but all along there was a great favor to business, to private businesses. The usual story is, well, the government gave concessions to make railroads or to build one thing or another, all of the great business that took place during those years. But I don't think it worked that way. It was really the businessmen who were coming to the government saying, "Give me a concession." The initiative was a part of the business, and the government basically responded by saying, "Okay, good. I'm glad you want it. Here it is." And so there was a lot of foreign investment, U.S. investment particularly, which was new. There hadn't been much before. It had been mostly British, but the British then sort of took a second breath and began to. The British had more investments in Mexico than the United States did in 1910, and but there were also Germans invested in trade and mines. And the French invested particularly in banks and in the textile industry. And so there was a lot of Mexican and along with Mexicans, a lot of Spaniards who had immigrated to Mexico, and a lot of European and U.S. investment. So the business boomed through those years. And so Mexico became, at least for many more people than it had before, a rather prosperous country. 3/4 of the country was really pretty poor and living on, I think the nominal wage for farm labor was something like 37 centavos, which amounted at that time to about 20 cents. Well, you should take into account too the wages that black labor got in the United States in those years, which were probably not much more than that, 20 cents a day. Um, and but there were that rural population was much larger percentage-wise, proportionally in Mexico than farm labor was in the United States. And so a much larger proportion of the Mexican population was really very poor, dirt poor, and didn't have couldn't eat meat, but maybe at most once a week, and the rest of the time lived on corn, beans, corn and corn tortillas and beans. But this business that was so successful during Porfirio's years was very impressive, and he gloried in it and thought that it would last forever, and did all he could to approve of it and advance it.
Now, what are some of the qualities that Zapata possesses that, make him such an effective revolutionary leader?
Well, I think one, you couldn't buy him. He wouldn't sell for anything. The guy who led the revolution, a northern businessman in 1910, he was murdered in 1913, but he called Zapata mi general integerrimo, my most honorable and honest general, and I think that was he got it right. You couldn't buy him. What he stood for, and when they drafted the original sort of document that they fought for 9 years, the Plan de Ayala. He never went back on that. Well, they elaborated it. They got new programs and so on during the convention. But that plan, that program, that plan for the country, he never changed that, and until the end. And then it was sort of smoothed out, and his plan was basically that the government, that the property that villages had lost would go back to them, and it was their property, the community's property. And once the revolution took command, regained control of the country in 1920. Basically, from the new constitution that the revolutionaries who killed Zapata put into practice in 1917, the villages weren't going to recover their property. What happened was the government basically claimed that it owned it was the original owner of the property of the land in Mexico, and so it would give grants of land to communities, but the property would remain the government's. And so villages had the claim to use the land as a sort of grant, but it was not theirs. but you had to show loyalty to the government. So basically, it was a way to keep rural people loyal. And because if they revolted, they took the risk of losing the land that had been granted to them. And so it was a very different thing that Zapata was fighting for, and that he lost finally. But I think he was true, in other words, to what he said he was fighting for, and that I think was the most was the most memorable thing about him. Unlike, I mean, most Mexican politics is very, what should I say, transactional. It's very, you give me this, I'll give you that. We'll both come out ahead, though I may come out before you do. And so it's all a matter of contracts and transactions. But Zapata wouldn't have any of that. And I think that made him most remarkable.
I see. Yeah. So, now in hindsight, looking back at what happened to Zapata and I suppose the revolution, so do you see him, well, as a tragic hero or as a hero who met a tragic end?
That's as professors say, that's a good question, which means I can't think of an answer right away. Uh, uh, I I think it was at this point in my life, at 40, how many years? It's been a long time since I wrote that. Several decades. I would say he was a tragic hero rather than a hero who met a tragic end. The latter would be the story that that the official revolution would tell. That he met. It was too bad he had to go, but the revolution triumphed, and so we're all glad for that. But I think in some way that, I mean, I think he was rather a tragic hero. And in that sense, that the Mexican Revolution was itself a tragedy. Because it was not, in my view, anything like the other revolutions that happened in the world around that time. The Russian Revolution of 1905, the revolutions in Europe and in Russia in 1917, 18, 19. The Mexican Revolution was tremendous violence. I think people say 1 million people died, 1 million Mexicans died, but I think it was nothing like that. Most people left and go to the United States and fleeing the violence. But at least something like 250,000 people were killed in revolutionary violence in basically the civil wars in Mexico. And so instead of a revolution sort of on like that in Europe in between 1905 and 1921, you had basically a civil war and 10 years of violence, and not much. Well, you had there was some gain. The old political class that had favored business so much was gone, but the businesses were still there. And not much else had changed other than that there was a new political class and a new constitution. But the regimes that followed that were not, on the whole, there were some exceptions, but the regimes that followed weren't that different from the years of Porfirio Diaz. So in that sense, the revolution was a tragedy, and not a great heroic beginning of wonderful things.
Okay. Now, I'd like to end on this note. What should Americans, and I suppose young Americans in particular, know about Zapata and the Mexican Revolution?
Uh, well, they that Mexico had a very pro-business government until 1910. Then that government collapsed under popular pressure, in large part from other businessmen who were in dispute with the government or against other businessmen, and for then that for 10 years there were civil wars, and after the civil wars ended and the triumph of one faction, they called it a revolution, and uh, and not that much had changed. I think if young Americans got that idea, which is a much more skeptical view of the Mexican Revolution, it would keep them from uh, um, believing the myths that the Mexican government circulates about the revolution and being a glorious triumph of popular causes. Um, the Mexican government is no different from other governments. It promotes the propaganda about itself, and it's like the U.S. does. That everything, I don't know, there was an American Revolution and everything's glorious since then. The Mexican Revolution does the same thing. The Mexican government does the same thing. We had a revolution, everything's glorious since then. But I think if young Americans can learn a certain kind of skepticism about what that revolution was, it's a good defense against believing all this propaganda.
I think that's a very good note to end on. Thank you very much, Professor John Womack, Jr., for joining the show.
And thank you very much, Ron. I'm honored to be on your podcast.